Another point with setups. Think, at least if we're not talking about throws, foot sweeps, trips, that type of, those type of movements. Think in terms of you're either going to attack low, in other words, attack the legs, or you're going to attack high to the head. And what I'm trying to get across now is, particularly for people that are beginning, sometimes they're with their opponent and they're thinking, I just can't get into their legs. I'm having a lot of trouble in the room being able to actually get into my opponent's legs. There could be a couple of reasons for that. One could be that your setup simply isn't effective enough to be able to move your partner or opponent into a favorable position to attack. But the other is that, and this is the main point here, that sometimes if I can't, and actually not just sometimes, but frequently, if I can't successfully attack the legs, or I'm really feeling bogged down in here, it's because his level is low enough such that I can attack the head. Okay? And I want you to think in that way. For example, if I'm trying now, because say I like to attack the head, I'm not having a lot of trouble doing that with Colby, I'm not able to pop it down, maybe it's because he's up high enough for me to be able to attack his leg, okay, or his legs in some way. And so I want you to think a little bit about that notion. When you're having difficulty attacking the legs, think, is the head available? We'll be going over attacks and things to attack and finish when you attack the head. And we'll be going over lots of leg attacks in some of the future instructionals. But I want you to get that notion down. If I'm having trouble attacking the legs, think what you can do to the head, and vice versa. If I'm having trouble attacking the head because I've been doing that a little bit, think about what you can be doing now to attack the legs. Because if you can't attack one, the other is very likely to be open, or at least somewhat open. Another point. Think about your distance. Your distance will dictate what type of setups and what type of attacks that are reasonable to initiate. For example, we had talked about different ways of lowering the level and getting into your opponent. If I'm close to my opponent, frequently it's quite sufficient to just lower my level and to drop in. And that's enough for me to cut the distance. However, if I'm at this distance to Colby and I just drop down, it's going to be very difficult for me to traverse from here to Colby effectively to be able to take him down. In which case, I'm probably going to be thinking more of a traditional drop step that we went over, where there's a lot more momentum inward. So, the distance really does dictate the type of attack, and you need to think along those type of lines. I'm not going to get into a lot of details about that now. That'll make more sense as we go along. But I want you to be able to think about that, and that's true, I think, for the mixed martial arts and no-holds-barred type fighting. Distances, in some way, dictate the type of techniques that you're going to use. As a second example, I wouldn't initiate a headlock with at this type of distance with Colby. That would be an inappropriate distance for me to initiate a headlock with. At the same time, if we're pummeling with each other, this is an appropriate distance for me to consider doing a headlock. We'll get more into that when we go into throws. But again, those are just two examples that distance is critical in terms of dictating what type of attacks are appropriate and are going to result in a higher probability of scoring, and those which are not. Now, I purposely haven't shown chains of setups, in other words, series of setups. Frankly, I think that's something that people need to develop on their own. And if you get familiar with the individual setups and you get familiar with the basic attacks, you'll learn what's comfortable and what seems to work good for your body build and your abilities. You'll get a sense of which setups and techniques are most effective for you to chain together. And that's a very personal thing, and I think you'll find that wrestlers vary tremendously in which type of setups they like to put together in a string before they actually attack. And you can imagine, just like in fighting, the more sophisticated your partner or opponent is, frequently the more sophisticated attacks you need to make, and sometimes that means that you need to be able to chain several setups together in hopes that perhaps the second, third, or fourth will ultimately result in an opening that will be favorable for you to attack. Just as a simple example, I can drag, and I might drag to an attack, perhaps a single or a double leg. I could pop Colby's head down. When he comes up, I can drag and go to that single or double leg. I might pop Colby's head down, drag, and he pulls this leg back, and I go to an inside fireman's carry. We'll go over that later in a different DVD. But what I'm trying to show you is you can, as you get familiar with the individual components, you can start chaining things together by simply doing one move, trying to think what feels natural and what's open to you, and then start stringing these techniques and these setups together, which will ultimately result in you being successful against more sophisticated wrestling type of opponents. And that really is critical. But again, that's a very individual and personal type of thing that you really do need to develop on your own. If you develop the setups and the attacks individually, you'll have no problem stringing them together, and you'll know what feels right for your body build and for your basic abilities and the type of style that you have. Finally, it's important to keep pressure on your opponent and control the pace. Like I mentioned earlier on, you don't just want movement for movement's sake. Sort of overarching that principle is the whole notion that throughout the course of the match, I want to do what I can to control the pace of the match, which means I need to be aggressive with my setups. Things need to flow from one thing to the next. I need to be thinking about what's open, what's not open, and most important, I want to be controlling the pace. If I'm wrestling with Colby, I don't want him to be the one initiating so that I'm defending and now I'm having to think how to respond. Right now, Colby's controlling the pace. I need to pop the head where, even if I'm not scoring, I want to be in a situation where I'm controlling my opponent, I'm controlling the pace so that he's responding to me. In that way, I'm less likely to be attacked successfully. There's a flip side to that, though. You also need to learn that if Colby, for example, or I need to learn that if Colby is controlling the pace, I need to be able to redirect that pace so that I can become in control. When we do some pummeling exercises in future DVDs, I'll go over those type of principles with you. But you need to control the pace of the match, and you need your setups to be successful enough to be, and tie-ups to be successful enough to do that. 2, you also need to be able to get from a position where your partner is controlling the pace, break that attack or that position of your opponent, and redirect it so that you begin controlling the pace. There'll be things we'll talk over in the future about those situations, but it's critical ultimately that you're doing what you can to control the pace. There's no reason for us to just hang out here, for example. Both of us, if we're going to be aggressive, want to make contact with each other. Colby comes in, he locks up with me. Now all of a sudden, I feel I'm in a very defensive type of position here. That's not good for me. I want to be able to change that situation so that I can begin controlling the pace again and being in a position where it's more likely then that my attacks are going to be successful because he keeps responding to my movement, and that his attacks will be less successful because he's so concerned about responding to my movements, he doesn't have a lot of thinking time as well as a lot of good position to initiate a successful attack.